We have now been joined by two distinguished colleagues who are going to talk about some real-life ways of addressing the kinds of polarizing challenges that come up. And we're going to do this again sort of shotgun style, but I want to thank Bob Kaplan, who today at least came a long way from Los Angeles via Cincinnati, even though Rabbi Bob Kaplan is in New York as the director of the Center for Community Leadership at the JCRC in New York, and thank you for being here today. And also Stephanie Hausner, who is the Director of Community Strategy of the Israel Action Network, which is a joint, I'm not sure how it's framed today, but JFNA and JCPA are partners in this incredibly important endeavor. And Stephanie is here in part pinch hitting for Carol Brick-Turin, who is somehow or other otherwise occupied in Miami, Florida, has been listening in, and we're thinking of Carol and her entire community and everyone who has been submerged in the Southeast and South in recent weeks. So let me start with you, Bob, and just simply ask you, can you come up with an example of a polarizing, an example that you think folks can relate to of a polarizing issue in New York that you had to deal with?
Sure. Let me just, I'm going to take it from the 30,000-foot view, because a lot of the scenarios dealt with the quote-unquote the big issues, the stuff that we don't necessarily have any real capacity to necessarily change on the global aspect. We can change on the local aspect and how it affects us on the local aspect. I've been with JCRC now, next week will be 24 years. And I was brought in, prior to that I was the Hill Director at NYU, and I was ran all the Hills in Greater New York area. Right after a little bit of a crisis in the Jewish community of the United States called Crown Heights. And I was brought in to put out the fires. And there was a whole lot of fire after that. There was a lot of disagreement, a lot of difficulty between the Jewish community and the African American community in New York City, but nationally as well, because it wasn't just what was happening in New York, it was happening nationally as well. However, when we began to take a look at what happened in Crown Heights, what we began to understand is that had we had the relationships in place, had we knew who to talk to, had we understood what was coming down the pike, because Crown Heights didn't happen because of the car accident. That was sort of the causation of that particular day, but it didn't happen because of that. It had happened because of racism. It happened because of changing community. It happened because of American Jews becoming American Jews and participating in American racism, and all that stuff. Had we been aware, had we been better at doing our homework prior to, we might not have had 3 days of riots in New York. So on the 25th of the riots, it was just last summer, we did something really unusual. We did something called we celebrated the 25th anniversary. How do you celebrate a riot? Well, we started off in the morning with a commemoration of what happened in the community at the Brooklyn Jewish Children's Museum. And then we had an afternoon of celebration in the community about a half a mile away in the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And ostensibly we have had a coalition in Crown Heights for over 20 years called Project Care, where we've had leaders knowing how to work with each other, look at community problems, dialogue with each other, and have the kinds of relationships where they can call each other up on the phone, and when something happens in the community, they can deal with it. Well, I'll tell you, no one predicted, and sometimes you gotta be nimble on your feet, about some of the deep, dark feelings of 25 years ago when you opened up the wounds of Crown Heights of 1991. Some of the older folks in the community, on both sides of the equation, the African American and the Jewish community, well, the wounds came open and they started to bleed again. And people really went at each other. And we were a little bit surprised, just a little bit, because there was something else happening in that community we needed to be painfully aware of, and we were, is that Crown Heights is now the fastest gentrifying community in New York City. It is no longer a community that is primarily African or Caribbean American. There is now a new white population there of gentrifiers from all the towns that are sitting around here. They've all come to New York, and all the young folks that are moving into that area. And these are not necessarily folks from Chabad. We had to be able to negotiate between all the various different sides because wounds opened up, and then old new communities wanted to create new realities. However, we had spent 24 years developing relationships in the community, and the day happened and the scenario happened. We had our commemoration in the morning. Some people are unhappy, some people were happy. And then we had our celebration in the afternoon. Some people were happy, some people weren't happy. This summer, the community pulled together an entire day of celebration during the summer. It doesn't look back 25 years, it's looking forward, because of the relationships we had put together, the connectivity that had happened between the folks in the community that don't always necessarily love each other, like each other, or want to move it forward.
Thank you. What a wonderful example of, a polarizing moment and continued issues that surface and turning it into a real positive. Stephanie, what would you think is an example of something you've encountered of a polarizing issue you've dealt with?
So I'm going to pick something within the Jewish community, and believe it or not, there's not community consensus on BDS or anti-BDS legislation, which I know some of you might be shocked for me to say. But in Seattle, Washington, which tends to be a very progressive community, both in the Jewish community and the general community. And many of you know, we of IN has made it a priority to work on anti-BDS legislation across the country, and 22 of your states have either passed legislation or your governor has signed an executive order. In Seattle, it took on a little bit of a different take. And last year, a very right-wing Republican legislator was quoted in the newspaper as saying, we need to do something about BDS and anti-Semitism on campus, and we should be limiting the speech of these groups. And so we, the Jewish community and the Federation in Seattle, and we said, hold on a second, we can't be looking at limiting the free speech of these groups. And some of you may have heard this before, in that any of this legislation does not involve college campuses, because we feel like academic freedom is still something we value. But there was a little bit of a crisis moment in Seattle, because you had this outside group coming in and saying, we want to do this, without talking to the Jewish legislators first, without talking to the Jewish community first. And so the Federation NY-JCRC ended up playing a lot of backup and a lot of cleanup for what had gone on in that particular moment. A more right-wing pro-Israel organization kind of came in and tried to push things forward, again, contradicting what the kind of goals of the committee were. So this summer, working with Max Potasnik, who's excellent, great JCRC and government affairs director out in Seattle, we decided to start from the beginning, what we hoped would be the beginning, and really bring every Jewish voice in the community together around the table to discuss what they thought would be the best path forward in terms of this anti-BDS legislation. The reason I'm mentioning it is because we knew going in that some of these groups invited, like J Street, like the New Israel Fund, don't support this type of legislation, but we felt it was important to have every voice around the table. And so from left to right within the tent, everyone was around the table, so no one at any point could say, our voice was not heard, right? So we had both boards of rabbis, AJC, ADL, APAC, J Street, NIF, and everyone gave their few minutes, and as a group reached consensus. And why am I bringing this up as an example? Is because the polarization in that room was high, but starting the conversation, and Max introduced the conversation by saying, we're not all going to agree on this issue, but we need to give everyone the opportunity. And I think last year in that community, everyone who was in the room, a couple of organizations were not in the room, and but everyone who was in the room gave space to hear what each other was saying. And I think we talked about listening a few minutes ago, and everyone listened. Not everyone agreed, But together they were able to move towards consensus because we were able to have that conversation. And sometimes I think we get a little, in terms of trying to bring the poles together from within the community, we sometimes don't want to have that interaction. And it actually, I think, helped the result.
So, and I think that's an example of something I was talking about on a theoretical level earlier, which is civil discourse as a tool toward consensus building, even though civil discourse can exist, as an independent value, but also as a tool toward consensus building. I'm going to keep right now with the focus on some more questions for the panel. For either of you, if you were, and maybe beyond Crown Heights, other examples as well. Crown Heights is, so large in a way as an example, but it could also be from there if you wanted to. But what did you see as the impact of the polarization that you, in the community? What are some of the ways in which it impacts the community?
Well, it can tear up a community really fast. And communities are very fragile pieces. And internally to the Jewish community and externally is that they're incredibly fragile unless you have the relationships in place. We have spent, as I mentioned, I've been doing this for a really long time. What we have done over these many years in a deliberate methodology is identified who are the up-and-coming leaders in the context of every community in New York. And New York is a very complex place. And we've developed scenarios, we developed methodologies of engaging them in problem solving around complex issues in their own communities that affect them, so that when the big stuff happens, they know each other, they know how to work with each other, they know how to respect each other, and they know how to avoid the conflict the next time around. So we do this through coalition building. We've built coalitions around healthcare, education, public safety. We do this through leadership development. We have something that's in your packet called We Are All New York. It is sort of a combined now. We used to have a fellowship in Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, and Northern Manhattan. We have engaged over 1,000 up-and-coming leaders in New York that now have networks and knowing how to work with each other. And the most important thing is that they go back to their own communities and they do it there. So we become part and parcel of what they create. We see it happen on a localized level where they have now the skills and the relationships to diffuse problems before they happen sometimes and when they're happening. And also, just apropos to your BDS thing, because I think the BDS is the big boogeyman in the room, is that I asked during Shavuot, who is the most important person in the Jewish community in New York? And, people were talking about this one. I said, it's a woman named Linda Saussure. We think she is the scariest person around. Well, I can show you my selfie with Linda, and I'll give you her phone number. I know Linda for 15 years. She's a scary person. However, she's not the driver of the issue. She is a symptom of an issue. And unless we understand what the symptoms are, we can't begin to deal with the real illnesses. We like dealing with symptoms. We don't like illnesses because illnesses take a long time to heal. Symptoms we rub some salve on.
It's interesting. In just the first few minutes, I often talk about the 4 C's of our work, and you've named all 4, which are civil discourse, coalition building, consensus building, and clearinghouse. All 4 are key functions. So very interesting. And what about from your vantage point, Stephanie, some of the impacts you've seen?
So I'm going to use a different example and talk about the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Some of you might have seen last March and April, they actually had 3 BDS votes on campus, but that wasn't really the story. The story was about the climate. It became so polarized on the University of Madison campus where it became not about the BDS vote, right? It was about, there was a BDS vote. It became the position that Jewish students were in. There was one Jewish student on the student council, and literally at the 3rd meeting after Passover, in which they finally voted on BDS, or finally passed, there were people who were part of SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, Muslim Students Association, and the African American Student Association on campus were there with signs calling out Ariella, this particular student on campus. The toxicity, the environment on campus, which really started because there was an initial BDS vote and the Jewish students came out in force, and other students at the University of Wisconsin on their board felt that those students weren't there for other causes, right? And it kind of goes back to what Bob's saying, is the relationships weren't there. As part of that first debate, there was one guy who kept yelling after every speaker, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. When will you say Black Lives Matter? And part of his point was that we're listening to you, but you weren't there for us, right? And so why are we going to be here for you now, right? And maybe this is like a 19-year-old college student, right, opinion, but why should I be here for you if you were never at the rally when we had all these issues in Madison in terms of Black student issues? And so I think it was a wake-up call for the Jewish students on campus. It was also a very hard time for the Jewish students on campus. There were things scheduled on Passover when they wrote letters to the student council and administration saying they couldn't come. The anti-Semitism they experienced was belittled by student council members. Fast forward to last week, the first meeting of the ASM, which is their student body, they had the person who was leading that charge, she had to issue a public apology. She also had to go in ADL training as part of the student judicial sentence, I guess, against her. But what they were able to do is build support amongst the rest of the members of student council, not really related to her. To start out the school year, the first thing they did was a resolution against anti-Semitism, right? Because they were able to, after they had to go through this horrific incident, but after they went through the horrific incident, they started reaching out. And people came to them and said, I never thought about that before. I never heard you before until I really saw it in place. And so part of it is then bridge building from that experience. And now the semester seems to be, knock on wood, off to a good start. But these kinds of issues bubble up on campuses across the country. And sometimes Tufts University, other universities, no one realizes they need to gain that support or look to be there for other organizations. And in partnerships, they've been able to kind of end that toxic environment.
I really appreciate your mentioning the word toxicity. I think I mentioned a T word before, which is time suck, and the amount of time, energy, psychic energy that goes into addressing polarized environments. But the toxic effect, I think, is critically important as well. Let me ask you and Bob, maybe from your vantage point, maybe to also reference what's in the packet here, but proactive efforts aimed at undertaking, not addressing an immediate crisis, right, when you're in the crisis, but proactive efforts to try to diminish the prospect that polarization will arise going forward.
So let me just follow up on something you said. By the way, Black Lives Matter. That's important. That's really important. Because if I have to deal with Black leaders in New York or on issues that are really important to them, if I don't acknowledge that, and by the way, the complexity, and that's a very hard word to wrap your head around, complexity. The complexity, somebody mentioned it before, of the definition and the scope, the Black Lives Matter movement is not boiled down to a couple of statements in that big thing that they did that was done by a group within a group of a group of a group. Black Lives Matter means different things to different folks within the context of the community, and we need to understand that, we need to hear it, and we need to respond to it. Because if we don't, they ain't gonna, you said it well, they ain't gonna come out for us and they ain't gonna care about us at all. So one of the ways that we deal with that is, I mentioned, we have this We Are All New York Fellowship. Well, we have, like I said, hundreds of leaders. We have another fellowship called Youth Bridge, which is our teen fellowship before they go to college. We had one called Community Connections, and Federation in its wisdom decided that funding wasn't appropriate anymore for that as well, where we trained community leaders in the skills of intergroup relations and community building. We bring people together to learn how to learn with each other, to know each other, to understand each other, and to value diversity within the context of the society, to understand what the other folks' issues are in the context of a society, and when stuff happens, those networks are there. So for instance, 4 years ago, there was a bad police shooting in a particular part of Brooklyn. It was 4 alumni from the We Are All Brooklyn Fellowship that stopped the riot. Now, we were involved in it because we taught them the skills to know how to go about doing it. One of them was a local pastor. Another one was the representative of the mayor in the community. Another one ran a community mediation center. Another one was on a local community board. And we were behind the scenes because it happened in a black community. They didn't want us there openly. They wanted to deal with it locally, but we were there for them. By the way, 2 of those pastors went on a mission to Israel last January. They had a great time, and they're bringing back 250 of their congregants this January. It's that long-term relationship building that changes the process. And I'll finish with one other thing. 2 of the people on the mission that I got back from 2 weeks ago were the 2 women that developed the New York Women's March. By the way, they don't get along with some of those folks that did the National Women's March for a lot of good reasons. They don't like some of the messaging that's coming out of that world. But they turned down 400,000 women here in the city of New York. I work for the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I am concerned around the streets of New York City. I want to know what's happening in my communities, and I want the relationships to be in place so that the Jewish community of New York are not only partners, but to be very transparent, are safer in the context of New York with our changing demography, our changing sense of power, the context of power, and all the other stuff that's going on. And to go right back to your campus thing, the changing diversity of intergenerational notions where we have no idea how to talk between the generations. And I think that's probably one of the scariest and most under-addressed issues within the context of the Jewish community.
Thank you. And by the way, in the packet, you'll see a couple of papers that Bob provided on the Community Connections Fellowship Program. If you're interested, you can contact Bob at Kaplan B at jcrcny.org. Great. And by the way, I come from the school that everything's scalable. So don't be scared off by the size
By
of
the
the
way, it's
city.
just been replicated in Munich, and it's been replicated in Sydney, Australia, both the adult one and the children one.
Great. So you want to learn more, because obviously this is just a taste. Please be in touch with Bob. Stephanie, same question. Proactive efforts to kind of ward off or build the culture that can best protect against the worst effects of polarization.
So I would say, just to kind of lead off from where Bob ended, the younger generation, right? And I feel like we've alluded to it at a couple of points today. But part of it is that we can't, right? And I'm technically still a millennial, but although I try not to identify with that. We tend not to, right? We decide what it is that the younger generation doesn't understand. And we all do it, right? Like I might make that judgment on college students or high school students, and we don't always ask them. And I know it sounds so basic, but making sure that we're including some of those younger voices in the conversations that we're having on the communal level and the communal table, because it's going to be a very different perspective. Even the idea of talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about being there for other communities is something that is intrinsic in some of these, the under 35 age group, that it might not be. It may be in a different way. People are looking less at what are the fault lines and more about, well, why can't we dive right in? And it becomes a little bit sometimes of a communal challenge. I would also say on the relationship side, and because I'll put on my working on campus community issues hat for a second, is that I think this is going to be a rough year. We already saw the first week of campus at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, a anti-fascist, anti-Zionist rally in which we had not the most supportive administration at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, supporting the Jewish students, where potentially there were safety issues. Daron Horowitz was here yesterday. It could be a good resource for that. But part of it is also that we need to help our students and help our Hillel directors with basic community relations. right? Because it's not something that is intrinsic to them or how they do business on a daily basis, but it is to us. And it's a huge place where we can play a role in helping them weed through what are the relationships that need to be formed. Sometimes we have those relationships within our communities and can be an asset to the Hill director or the students on campus. And sometimes we can kind of help them in that relationship building pattern, because it is something that I think we've seen over the past couple of years that we haven't been as successful as we have been in the past, and we need to start moving forward.
Great, thank you. Very briefly, one lesson you've learned from operating in or seeing a polarized environment. What's the lesson you've learned?
So I would say every community is different, and I would say the Roger Waters concert situation of this summer, which I'm so excited that he's going to be done performing in a couple of weeks. I think I've spoken to 18 of the 21 communities that are hosting Roger Waters, and every community has a different angle on how they are going to react towards it. And that's absolutely right, because no community is the same and no community can have the same reaction. And in terms of dealing with your internal Jewish community, those are also challenges. I think a lot of communities have used the DC video, some communities have used the JCRC, New York JCRC materials, but everyone's kind of had to repackage in their own way. And I think it also shows the value of this network, that we really can try to figure out what we could take from each other and what we might disagree on in terms of how we respond to particular situations.
Bob?
So even though I say that I've been doing this for a really long time and the methodology works, and you're right, Doug, it's scalable. It can happen anywhere. Doesn't really make a difference. The most essential piece of what we do is relationship building. We are the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. Having those relations in place and listening to them with an empathetic mind and heart and soul, lending dignity to the other's narrative, is a radically important part of what we do. If we don't do that, we're working within the Beltway, and we all do that all too often, and we're never going to be able to continue to be a part of the changing power structure of New York's or the United States' new diversity.
Excellent. Well, can you join me in thanking Bob and Stephanie for really important insights on the ground? Thank you both.